assessment. And I think in the last 1 year or so, we've really been seeing a increase in interest in this area. I'm sure, on social media, you've been seeing a lot more articles about self-care, about stress, about burnout. So it's really been the talk of the town. And actually, I've been, this set of slides I've been using for several rounds already, and I've been speaking. This is the second time actually I'm speaking to a group of helping professionals. We did one earlier last year, and every time actually I give this talk, I do a little bit of tweak because the situation has been changing so much, and we are always progressing, and we're finding different circumstances and different challenges. And this article was just published, just before I gave that session to the public on Saturday in early April, and it was just 1 year on from the circuit breaker, and so people have been talking about all the impact that they felt. And in fact, if you look back at the last 1 month and where we are now, we are again at another juncture, another different stage, phase 2 and more restrictions, etc. So all this has been, in a sense, posing this kind of strain on us, a mental health burden. And what is it doing to us? I hope that today's talk can be relevant in that area. So essentially, when we talk about stress, we first try to understand what is it that we are experiencing when we talk about stress. We throw around the word quite casually, but essentially stress is a situation of a mental or emotional strain that results from adverse or demanding circumstances. Okay. And what we know about stress is that it's actually regulated by an older part of the brain, a more primitive part of the brain called the limbic system that controls our emotions and memories. And especially it's governed by this area called the amygdala. It's an olive-shaped structure that sits roughly in the middle of the brain and acts as the threat center. In other words, it kind of detects danger that we are under, and it reacts to it. It reacts to it by kind of triggering the release of actually hormones. So actually a lot of the stress reaction or responses that we experience physically, emotionally, are regulated through the brain, through these hormonal reactions. And especially when we talk about stress hormones, we're talking about things like adrenaline and cortisol. So there is a very strong biological, neurological kind of basis for undergoing stress. But essentially, when we talk about stress, it's often used in negative terms, but is it really always bad? The truth that it isn't, because as human beings, we do need a level of stress to function well. In primitive prehistoric times, in terms of our ancestors, biological survival was actually dependent on a properly working stress response. In a sense that when we are faced with danger, you do want the body to respond, to react in a certain way. And so when we are under stress appropriately, in short bursts, in manageable amounts, actually, some stress does improve our interests, our levels of interest, our levels of attention, and actually our physical performance as well. When there is a total lack of stress, actually it impacts our motivation levels. There's no drive, there's no motivation to do well, results in actually lower performance, and actually there's no growth, there's no learning, there's no transformation. On the flip side, actually, when stress levels are too high, that's when it tends to become a negative impact on our well-being, because we are constantly aroused, we are constantly anxious, we can't focus, and then conversely, accordingly, our performance then deteriorates. So there is a band actually when stress levels are temporary, when they are short-lived, when it's in manageable amounts, when it does benefit our performance. Okay, so not all stress is bad. It's just that sometimes we are not very good at identifying stress, or when stress is not so good, which I'll come to a little bit later. And Similarly, often when we talk about stress, we also bring in this concept about burnout. And there's been a lot of talk about burnout in academic circles, in the medical community. But we use the term, quite freely, quite casually. But when we talk about burnout, especially when it's job related, right, what does it mean? When we use the term burnout as a concept, what we are referring to is a psychological syndrome, which means it's just a cluster of symptoms, psychological symptoms that emerge as a prolonged response to chronic job-related stress. Okay, so the key words here are chronic and job-related, when the stress is job-related. And burnout actually we can diagnose burnout in some way because the symptoms are well described by researchers. And the first of which, the key sign of burnout that we tend to look for is exhaustion, especially when we talk about more emotional or psychological exhaustion. So this is a sense of being worn out, that you feel low energy or you cannot sustain your energy throughout the workday, when you're feeling fatigued very easily. So it can be physical, but most often it's a sense of emotional exhaustion. Second point is this term called cynicism. It's a big word, but all it means is that your attitudes towards your clients, the people you're trying to help, could be patients, as well as your colleagues, the people you work with, become more negative because you no longer have the resources to cope. Therefore, you are no longer able to see clients or your colleagues really as people. Rather, they become entities that are demand on your resources. So you tend to want to protect, your ability to cope, and therefore you kind of turn against them a little bit. Sometimes it manifests as a little bit of irritability. It manifests as loss of idealism. Sometimes people turn a little bit. If you notice, sometimes colleagues who are, not coping very well, they may become passive aggressive. They become, they say, everything also cannot. That kind of picture, or some people even become outwardly and quite actively aggressive. They may become rude. They become short-tempered. These kind of symptoms are what we call cynicism. The third one is a sense of decreased personal efficacy or achievement. It just means that your performance will start to worsen. So usually the first two will happen first, and it results in this third area of manifesting. Because when you can't sustain energy and when you can't work well with your clients and with your colleagues, then clearly your work performance, your productivity is going to go down. Your sense of motivation and the purpose and meaning you gain from work starts to decrease as well. So low productivity, you start having problems coping, morale decreases. Classically, when we talk about three areas, if you start picking up strong signs that you have at least two areas, of which exhaustion is the key, then we typically say that this staff or this worker is burnt out. All right. Okay. Now, the key thing to understand is burnout really is an interplay between person and the organization. That means the workplace or the system that they are working within. So this is where the job-related idea comes in. When we talk about burnout, that we have various ways of measuring burnout. There are questionnaires that you can do and all these things. But when oftentimes, at least in my experience dealing with burnout in teams, in departments, or in organizations, it's one thing to measure burnout, but measurement and tools measuring burnout don't really tell you the causes of burnout. What causes burnout? Now, this where things become a little bit complicated because if you can think about it logically, right, the causes of burnout within each team or each department are going to be different and unique from other teams or departments because the work environment is unique to each team itself. So when researchers tried they kind of defined burnout, then they figured out ways of measuring it. Their third step was actually, how do we find out what are the risk factors or the causes of burnout? they did a lot of interviews, and research into the area. And one of the models that was proposed is that we can approach burnout from 6 different areas of work life. So this is called the areas of work life model, where they distilled 6 major themes in each workplace that can help each team or organization figure out why are their staff having high rates of burnout. And workload is often very is often the first complaint that staff have when they cannot cope. They feel that workload is very high. They don't have enough time or not enough resources to deal with workload. So this is definitely one of the key areas. But the other areas are just as important, and a sense of control, or rather that it's a sense that your ability to give input or make decisions or make changes in the workplace is actually also quite important to a lot of workers. No one likes to be in a situation that they feel very out of control and they are just told to do things. They don't have a sense of ownership into the process and the outcome. Reward is another key area. Of course, the most obvious reward when it comes to work is our salary, right? But when the researchers interviewed people, they realized that there are other less tangible, non-tangible aspects of reward. For example, recognition is very important. Rewards can be in the forms of awards, or non-tangible also includes intrinsic value, intrinsic reward. What I mean by intrinsic reward would be things like especially relevant for us in the helping professions, when actually just by doing the work of helping others is rewarding to us in itself. So work in itself can be rewarding. Of course, we are rewarded in other ways, like compliments, recognition in the workplace by our bosses, as well as tangible rewards like monetary compensation, etc. So rewards don't just cover the tangibles. Community is equally important. Community refers to your colleagues, the relationships that you have at work. And they found that this is a key area that kind of mediated whether burnt out people would choose to leave organizations. It depends on whether they have strong bonds with their colleagues, whether there's trust, whether there's mutual support and help within the workplace. So that's community. A sense of fairness. Fairness is when you feel that decisions are made that are equitable, that are transparent. There's no favoritism in the organization. Promotions and rewards are given fairly. So this appeals to our innate sense of justice, right? That's a very fundamental part of our being that when violated, we feel very uncomfortable with. Therefore, this is a major area as well that talks about that moderates burnout. And finally, values. Values is something that's quite deep-seated. Generally, values not such a big area of conflict, especially in the helping professions, healthcare, education, all these, because our industry tends to require values that are more positive, right? Altruism, compassion, selflessness, all these things. People who don't have such strong concepts of these positive values may struggle in these kind of helping professions. Conversely, I often give the example where values would be at conflict. If I ask you to work in a casino, for example, if you had to work as marketing in casino and your job was to actually create ways and schemes to encourage people to spend, encourage people to come and gamble, and does that sit well with your values as a person? If it does not, then that fit together with between you and your job would not be very good and may also contribute to the burnout process. So if you notice that so far I've talked about all these areas, but there is no clear benchmark that says every organization must have good workload, good control, high reward, very strong community, very fair and good values. it is not a sense that there is a threshold that organizations must hit, but rather whether or not staff become burnout is a degree of match or compatibility between staff and the job characteristics. So take for example the casino job. Casino job would, let's say, have extremely high reward. Maybe the workload is very high and they don't have a sense of control. Values need to be compatible with your own values, and if my sales are good, then I am very well rewarded. So there can be jobs that are actually high workload and high reward and low control, but the person can accept it. It fits well with me as a person and the way that I do work. Then actually the person is unlikely, or this staff will have a low risk of burning out. Conversely, if the areas of mismatch kind of outweigh the benefits, then the person is more likely to burn out. So it's not a one size fits all. There's no answer to this. It's really an analysis of the person's expectations towards their job, as well as the characteristics of the job itself. One thing that I often introduce when talking to people from the helping professions, from the human services, is this idea of compassion fatigue. It's a rather unique area of our job that through talking to colleagues, people in the hospital, to younger colleagues in doing social services, etc., is this idea that that is so inbaked in us or ingrained in us that this job requires us to be selfless, and it requires us to make sacrifices, and we need to go above and beyond, go the extra mile to help people. So the idea, but the flip side of that is well and good to do. I think it benefits our clients, our patients, certainly. But on the flip side, it exposes support staff, people in human services, to this idea of compassion fatigue. And essentially what this is an emotional response when we are working with people who are suffering, can be from trauma, from prolonged illness, etc., people from adverse circumstances. Why this is because oftentimes when we are trying to help people in need, the interactions are often charged with negative emotions. They often have certain expectations that you are here to solve my problems, and therefore you need to do something that will benefit me. But oftentimes the solutions are not always obvious. In fact, solutions are oftentimes, I'm sure you have realized by now, that solutions are not often, they don't often match with what the client actually wants. So what will work best for the client may not be what the client actually wants. So that mismatch sometimes leads to a lot of frustration, a lot of guilt, a lot of resistance from client. And this kind of chronic stress also can lead to burnout. And as I mentioned just now, even when things go well, sometimes staff get burnt out because they are constantly, pushing themselves to do more. I must help my patient more. I must do more for my clients. It's not good enough. What if I don't look after my clients? No one else will. These kind of patterns of thinking sometimes drive us to burn the candles at both ends, and we end up feeling really tired and fatigued. And also, this kind of working with people in the human services requires a lot of these attitudes of empathy, of compassion, stepping into the shoes of other people, kind of sharing their feelings. That can be draining in itself. And the drive to always be compassionate is also, where we are always pushing ourselves to try to help them. So compassion fatigue is another area that, the human services, social services tends to be exposed to. Now, and I'll come down to, okay, where are we when we are trying to make sense of stress? Stress doesn't just come from our jobs also. Clearly, in current situations, this is applicable to us as individuals, but also the people that we're trying to help, the clients who are in need. Where are we in terms of understanding our emotional response to the pandemic so far? Okay, And this concept of that the disaster has different phases of emotional response is well described in actually disaster literature, where crisis management literature, they kind of talk people through how we progress through the phases of disaster. So what usually happens, I want to just focus on 4 key areas, 4 stages. The first of which is, oh, my slides are in the wrong order, but the first of it is actually the impact. So this is when the disaster hits and we feel the first impact. And the first impact is marked by some negative emotions. So there's a downward trend where there's fear, there's confusion, you start feeling isolated, there's a lot of anxiety. This is when we are starting to make sense of a new threat, a new kind of danger that we are confronting, and we are needing to mount a response. So there's a degree of fear and anxiety about it. But once we get over the initial fear, the initial response, we tend to rally together. And this was very clearly seen in the COVID situation, especially among healthcare workers, where we mounted that response. And that's a very natural thing that communities do. We band together, the rallying of resources. Everyone's leave was frozen. People were put on shift, a lot of adjustment of the roster, but there's high levels of engagement. People were willing, people were stepping up. There was a lot of volunteerism. The events were marked with a high sense of altruism and increase in productivity. So very interestingly, when workload was high in hospitals during this phase, burnout levels or stress levels were low. Take-up rates for support services like counseling and all that. We created hotline, we created email for people to contact us, but very few people did actually. And that was interesting because we were in a sense of that kind of heroic phase and a little bit of that honeymoon period. So the honeymoon is marked by, we are riding on the positive emotions, we are kind of triumphant, we are victorious against the threat. We've managed to contain the infections, we've ring-fenced it, and people are feeling grateful, our government is doing well, we are inspired and all these things. So that is the honeymoon phase. So this where the positive emotions ride out slightly. But over time, especially when the disaster has high impact, like what we've experienced, as well as prolonged duration, clearly, which is what we are in now, this does not sustain. It actually quite markedly goes down. In a sense, fortunately, we were kind of looking forward to, opening up, and we managed to open up to a certain degree. Unfortunately, we are so, in a sense, so confined and with travel restrictions around, we were still quite limited in terms of what we are able, how we were able to seek, leisure and all these things had to adjust a lot. So people were feeling the effects of this. But we were gradually actually riding out as we were opening up slowly, we were riding out the disillusionment phase. So this is when disillusionment phase is the 4th phase, when reality sets in. You're starting to feel worn out, you're frustrated with all the restrictions and the changes. If there was a sense of loss, there was great loss through the disaster, then there's a lot of dealing with grief. So this was the disillusionment phase, and over time you slowly recover. Reconstruction and recovery involves the recovery period. Unfortunately, where we are now is this point here, where there is a setback, and setbacks do happen. Clearly, as we have seen, unfortunately, we were a bit lax, and infection has crept up again, and so new restrictions came in, and downward we are somewhere around here probably at this point. So understanding these phases sometimes can be helpful in us understanding what we are experiencing ourselves, as well as what our people around us are experiencing. So this is all very well documented. People have described it very well before. What does chronic stress do to us? When we are constantly under so much stress, right? You have a flood of the hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, all these things. The unfortunate thing is we are not very good at differentiating between good stress and bad stress. It's a bit like a frog in a pot of slowly boiling water, right? So if you're, most of us feel that, oh, I can still manage, I'm still coping, I can do a little bit more, I can push myself a little bit more. There's always a little bit more to go, and we're not over the threshold yet. So very often in my experience in the clinic, when I see patients, they often come in really when they are at the point when they are beyond or past that line, past that threshold, and they are starting to experience significant amounts of all these, very distressing symptoms. So we often experience stress unconsciously, and there's no clear marker or trigger that tells us, okay, there's no that line for yourself is not very clear. Unfortunately, when we are under constant stress, right, what happens is that danger center in our brain tends to be more easily triggered. It's harder to turn off. It's always on the on mode, okay? And people have shown that, long-term stress results in disturbances. So a lot of the body, different organ systems in the body. One thing that I often see in the clinic is people come with complaints that are physical in nature. They come complaining that they have difficulty breathing, they have palpitations, they're not eating very well, they got diarrhea, or they have headaches and they have aches and pains. So very often the complaints are physical in nature, and that's because stress and the stress hormones, the stress response tends to affect a large range of bodily systems. And so these manifestations are often physical in nature. But one of the key things I would like us to take away from today is learning really how to identify the signs of stress within yourself. Often this can manifest sometimes as sensations of worry or anxiety. It can manifest as physical tension, difficulty relaxing. So often you feel a lot of aches and pains in the body that suddenly start, and you don't really know why. In terms of the mood, it can cause you to have mood swings. So your mood may dip, you may feel that down and low, or you may become irritable, short-tempered. Your appetite can sometimes fluctuate. There may be changes in your gastrointestinal patterns, bowel patterns. And one of the very key areas is sleep disturbances. So you may find yourself having a lot of difficulty falling asleep, or conversely, your sleep may be quite broken. The quality of your sleep may be worse. You may feel you sleep lighter, you wake up very often at night, or actually you are starting to wake up early in the morning. So we call it early morning awakening. I tend to have a lot of this. So that's my sign of stress, because the brain wants to start working on your problems. It wants to get going again. So by early morning, when you're in the lighter phases of sleep, it just wakes up and it gets the day going already. Even though it's 5, 6 a.m., alarm has not gone, you're not ready to get up, but your brain is already active. So one thing to take away is that really manifestations of stress is going to vary from person to person. And the pattern that you tend to manifest stress as will be unique to you. So you need to learn to become aware of the sensations in your body, what you're experiencing. When you're under stress, how does it manifest? Anxious people will tend to manifest in anxiety. Some other people may manifest more as mood swings, more irritability or hot-tempered. Some people easily get gastric kind of symptoms. Some people don't, and so on and so forth. So these are warning signs. The patterns tend to repeat. That means when you are under stress, the pattern tends to be the same each time you meet your threshold of stress. So do tend to learn to notice those patterns early, and notice the early warning signs allows you to be able to do something about it, take some steps to ease it. I want to talk a little bit about what happens in the brain. There are certain things that, or rather habits of the mind. If I'm sure I'm talking to people who are quite well aware of this. I mean, all of you coming from Brahm Center and all these things, but I learned all this from Brahm Center. So a lot of the content has been what I've gleaned over the talks, the workshops, and the retreats. Habits of the mind really are all these patterns of thinking that we tend to adopt quite unconsciously, sometimes some subconsciously, that tend to amplify the stresses that we experience. We worry, we tend to go over our problems again and again, our imagination runs wild, or we tend to think the worst will happen. So learning to identify identify signs of stress, that you're under stress, and then secondly, identifying the patterns of your mind that kind of amplify the stress are part of the process. So habits of the mind are what internally drives our stress. Our lifestyle actually today doesn't help us a lot as well. Essentially, what we are seeing is much options, right? All around us is options, entertainment options lah, technology use, and a lot of things that allow us make our lives a lot more convenient. It also allows us to actually fill our time with a lot of distractions, and that's what I'm seeing a lot of, especially in our young people. So among the younger generation of people who come and see me for anxiety, for stress disorders, they often tell me that I actually don't spend a lot of time being aware of what I'm thinking about. Most of my time I'm keeping busy. That's very often the thing. I'm always busy. And when I have a moment, an idle moment or free time at night, especially, then my mood becomes very low, or I start getting very anxious. My panic attacks come at night and all this. It's because we are not spending enough time really on introspection. We're not really looking inward. We're not really doing a little bit of the housekeeping internally. And so too much distraction, too many options, we are always moving from one thing to another, is kind of really affecting our attention spans, and the autopilot mode tends to take over most of the time. So all these things kind of feed the stress that we are experiencing. So the last section of what I'm speaking about, actually I'm well ahead of time, so we have plenty of time for discussion, is actually self-care. And when we talk about self-care is again a very generic term. The definition of self-care is, in fact, is actually quite broad. It's any activity that we do deliberately in order to take care of our mental, emotional, and physical health, with the key word being deliberately here. So like what it says, right? Actually, if you look at the activities that we do, a lot of it fulfills the concept of self-care. It's nothing new. The only thing is that we often do it very subconsciously. We do it as a matter of convenience or as a matter of habit or routine. We don't really reflect on it, and we don't pay attention to it. So one of the encouragements, at least the takeaways from maybe today's talk, is really that recognizing that it's okay to do self-care, recognizing the importance of self-care, and that we need to be intentional about our self-care. Set aside time for it. And by doing so, by being intentional about it, we actually increase its effectiveness, because when we do something mindfully, we are able to appreciate it a lot more. For a lot of people in the helping professions, the idea is sometimes the obstacle is the inability to kind of let go and to recognize that it's okay for us to do self-care. We feel that sometimes it's selfish, or that the client is more important, and we need to do more for the client. So really the recognition here is to strike the balance. My encouragement is really, we need to look after ourselves first and foremost before we have the inward resources and the ability to look after other people. If we are constantly burning the candle at both ends, what happens is that we are burnt out, and we cannot sustain our mission, our calling to help other people. So always the idea that a lot of people will say that they feel guilty looking after themselves. They feel that they should be more productive with their time, right? And so the reminder here is really, self-care is not selfish. It's not unproductive. We do need to look after ourselves such that we can sustain our work. looking after other people. The last point is really, actually, activity should not be done out of routine. If something is not working for you, don't be afraid to change it, right? If so that's where the reminder to always review, to look back on your activities. Is it doing what your intention was set to do out of the activity? Are you getting out of the activity what you want to achieve from it? So try to review it regularly. Always don't be afraid to change the activity or do something else in place of it. So in terms of self-care, the first thing I often talk about is our physiological, or rather biological needs. And there are three main areas. First and foremost is, of course, sleep. Now, sleep in itself is a whole lecture on its own. So I can only touch on it just very slightly. Like I said earlier, it's often a first sign of mounting stress or anxiety. And the most basic recommendations that I can give is that your sleep habits are often the foundation of having good sleep. And that includes keeping regular hours, minimizing, distractions in your bedroom, etc. Technology use should be minimized in bed, at night and things like that. And very key component of it that I often have to remind or teach my patients is that part of sleep is letting go of expectations and trusting the body. One of the key realizations around sleep is that you will never be able to force yourself to sleep. Okay, no one has ever learned the ability to just flick a switch and say, I'm going to sleep now, and then they just turn off and they go to sleep. There's no such thing. So sleep comes naturally to the body. Part of it is learning to let go of expectations, because a lot of people who struggle with sleep tend to develop a lot of anxiety towards sleep. They become very insecure about their sleep, and that further drives the inability to sleep. It becomes a bit of a vicious cycle. So part of the learning to sleep well is actually letting go of expectations. And as I was talking about, as I'm sure a lot of you know, actually mindfulness is a very good way of learning this. In terms of diet, that's the second thing. So all three of these aspects of physiological needs are often overlooked. And diet, sometimes out of convenience, out of expediency, we want it to be fast. We tend to kind of turn to easy options, right? I'm guilty of that myself. Sometimes skip lunch, or buy convenient food, fast food, etc. But a lot of the more recent research around mental health has been pointing to the fact that good gut health leads to good emotional health as well. The outside of the brain, our gut is actually the organ that has the most nerve endings, the most extensive nervous system from really our mouth all the way to the anus. Really is lined with nerves, and this nervous system of the gut is actually intrinsically linked back to the central nervous system and the brain. So gut and the brain do communicate very closely. And so a lot of the research has been finding that the kind of gut environment, they call it the biome of the gut. That means all the bacteria in our gut, how healthy our gut is, actually links to our emotional health. So sometimes a lot of the research has been recommending probiotics, for example, good bacteria, good fermented foods, kimchi, yogurt, etc. I always tell, when I mention probiotics, patients always ask, oh, Yakult can or not? No, cannot. Yakult got more sugar than probiotics. So it shouldn't be, I typically don't recommend Yakult. But, other than probiotics, sometimes some people say take good omega-3. But otherwise, actually balanced diet, more fresh fruit, nuts, vegetables, all these are quite sensible things and should be definitely beneficial for our mental health. The last part is exercise. This one, myself, I'm guilty of ignoring. But in reality, exercise does help with tension, bodily tension. Goes back to the idea that our mind and body is intrinsically linked together. So exercise itself can increase our serotonin, good hormones, good chemicals in the brain, serotonin, endorphin levels, improves our sleep and cognition as well. So this is the three main areas of biological needs. Now, the second part is actually our social needs. So it's important to invest in our relationships. Develop a support system, both professionally and personally. Why both? Is because we need balance. We need people we can turn to for support, both at work as well as in our personal lives. So don't ignore your relationships in favor of work, especially in times like these when we are experiencing higher levels of isolation, right? I'm sure a lot of you in your work are coming across clients who are struggling with loneliness, with isolation, with disconnect because they can't deal with technology as well. This is going to be a key area. The second part of this is really, and I often tell people this, they sometimes are surprised, but don't neglect hobbies, leisure time. Develop new skills and interests, explore beyond your current comfort zone. Often people think that hobbies are a waste of time, or hobbies are luxury that, if I have time, then I will do. But in reality, as people, we form our identities based on the activities that we engage in. So work is clearly a core part of identity. Our spouse and our immediate family sometimes are a core part of identity. But beyond these two main areas, actually we also gain aspects of our identity through our extra kind of non-work related activities. Volunteering is a very good example, right? Your time as a volunteer is meaningful to you, gives you a sense of purpose. It forms a core part of your identity. But your hobbies as well, some people, I myself dabble in a little bit of pottery, keep plants sometimes. So a lot of all these things, kind of balance your life out a little bit, increases a sense of identity and accomplishment. All right, it makes your life a bit more varied, gives you a better sense of purpose across different domains. The last part is actually what I feel is really quite important. It's very important, and a lot of people don't have the skills to actually do this. Emotional housekeeping. When we went into the first circuit breaker, a lot of people struggled because suddenly the external world was very quiet. Everything slowed down. Activities, were cut down. All the social activities were much less. It was more isolated. And they realized that their internal house is quite messy because they cannot spend time outside the home anymore. They have to turn inwards and say, alamak, inside is so messy. I don't know what to do with it. So doing regular emotion, just like we do housekeeping, clean our house regularly, we need to do emotional housekeeping. How do we do that? Some of the tips I have really is to cultivate a habit of introspection or reflecting on your events and your emotions. Of course, don't do it blindly. If we end up ruminating, if we do it judgmentally, if we are only focusing on the negative things and we are kind of engaging in black and white thinking, it kind of plays up the stress. So don't do it blindly. We need to cultivate some positive values. And a good analogy that I once read about is, can we treat our emotions, both positive and especially our negative emotions, as if a mother tends to a baby? Now, those of you who know, it's just common sense in general. When a baby cries, the crying can be quite unpleasant, right? It's quite jarring, it's noisy and it's irritating sometimes. But does a mother treat a crying baby as an irritant? No, right? A mother treats a baby's cry as a warning sign. It's a sign that the baby needs attention. Similarly, our negative emotions are like an internal cry for our inward attention. So we should be dealing with our anger, with our sadness, with our anxiety, as a mother treats a crying baby. When we experience anger, can we approach the anger and say, oh, hello, I acknowledge that you are there. Can I spend some time understanding why you are manifesting? A mother tries to understand, why is the baby crying? Is the baby hungry? Is a baby uncomfortable, too hot, too cold? Is something upsetting the baby, or is there pain anywhere? Is the baby unwell? We try to do all these things. And similarly with our emotions, it's the same. When we experience anxiety, it's a very often, the one thing that people tend to react to anxiety with is avoidance. That to me is, in the short term is fine. When something happens and we don't yet want to deal with it immediately, we can avoid. A bit of denial is okay. But as a prolonged coping mechanism, avoidance for anxiety actually is quite bad, because it further reinforces the anxiety, and your anxiety over time will go up if you keep avoiding it. So that's why I always encourage my patients, you need to confront what you are experiencing. You cannot run away from it. Another part of it is learning to say no and drawing healthy boundaries for yourself. By becoming aware of your stress, by becoming aware of your emotions, we learn when is it we need to say, okay, this is my limit, or this is where my responsibility ends. So learning to be aware of your boundaries and responsibilities and set healthy boundaries, no matter with who. So even a lot of people will say to me, oh, this person is my son, or this person is my daughter, or my wife is like that, I can't help it. But really, no matter what relationship you have with other people in your life, there needs to be good boundaries. It doesn't mean that just because this person is your child, this person is your spouse, this person is your parent, you need to tolerate everything about them. Now, this is a bit controversial, but the reality is, I think everybody needs to learn to draw their own boundaries. When you have drawn the boundaries, you need to know that, okay, this is what I can accept. This is my limit. And if I were to cross that limit all the time, it's going to affect me and it's going to burn us both. So I'm not going to be able to help the person anyway. Finally, this is one very key component, is recognize that not everything lies within our responsibility or control. In fact, if you reflect closely, a lot of things in our life actually we cannot control. So this part of it is about learning to go with the flow with things, and being adaptable, being flexible is highlighted as one of the key components of being resilient, building internal resilience, learning how to adapt to new situations and change. So that's where it comes out of acceptance that, okay, some things are outside of my control. I just need to learn to deal with it, to let go of it. And finally, I usually end off by encouraging the practice of mindfulness in everyone. I think it's a very good way to improve emotional well-being. Firstly, because it's a very gentle, it's a very accessible way for people to start learning to develop a sense of awareness, to approach, with the right attitudes, to approach our emotions in a kind, compassionate, and gentle way. So that is one thing that I experience in terms of working with my patients, is that very often in local settings in our population, people often don't have the way of the language or the ability to express their emotions. So, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about things like therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. I myself tend to take a bit more of a cognitive approach. So I try to explore thought processes. I try to explore emotions. But to do so, you need people to be first aware of their thoughts and to be aware of their emotions. And very often I'm finding that there's a missing link in that in general population, people have very poor awareness of their inward workings, their mind, their thoughts, their emotions. They can't even say what they are thinking or feeling. So that's why often the first step that I introduce or I recommend is often mindfulness practice, because that's when it gives them an easy and quite clear, straightforward way of looking inwards, practicing that inward looking and developing a bit more awareness for what's happening inside with the right attitudes. We've covered a lot, non-judgment. So this last slide is a little bit about mindfulness for people who are not so familiar with it. It's really about learning to intentionally pay attention to something, anything in the present without judgment. So we've covered some of the attitudes, really. Non-judgment. We've covered what else? Patience. That's another one. Self-compassion, acceptance. Another one I particularly like is non-striving, going with the flow, learning not to struggle against your circumstances, learning to let go, accept and let go. So all these are mindful attitudes that are part that the mindfulness helps us to cultivate. At the same time, practicing regulating our attention. This helps us develop more emotional awareness, manage our emotions, reduce stress, strengthen the rational mind, logical decision making, improves our concentration. So that brings us more or less to the end of my sharing today. And I think we can have some questions.